When he walked into the courtroom, you could tell from the way he moved that he believed money and technology outweighed the law itself. For a moment, the space stayed frozen in midair. Judge Caprio had just finished easing through a series of light violations: speeding, a chipped tail light. Someone parked a little too close to a hydrant. The mood was mellow, almost neighborly. A few small laughs rippled through the benches whenever the judge cracked a gentle line. People relaxed. It felt like any other mild morning in Providence. And then the door opened. The shift was instant, like a draft of cold air pushing across warm tile. A 17-year-old walked in wearing a suit that looked tailored for someone accustomed to red carpet cameras. The fabric practically shimmered, far too expensive for a teenager who should have been thinking about senior prom. Not high-end fashion. In his hand glowed a phone with a metallic blue sheen, the latest device that half the country was still on waiting lists to buy. Hanging from his neck, a glossy badge from the Young Innovators Summit, a place usually reserved for startup prodigies and early investors. He didn't glance at the judge, not once. His eyes skimmed across the room like he owned it. The people waiting patiently in line for their turn, parents, veterans, nurses coming off night shift, might as well have been extras in a scene crafted only for him. He took a seat with a kind of practiced indifference, the sort teenagers rarely learn naturally. When the clerk called his name, he didn't budge. His thumbs kept moving, tapping out something with surgical speed. Only when whatever he was doing reached completion did he lift his gaze, as if granting the room a sliver of his time. He rose unhurriedly and walked to the microphone, still adjusting something on the screen. Judge Caprio asked gently for his name. The boy leaned on the stand with one elbow, posture loose, chin tilted upward. "You've probably heard of me," he said, almost bored. "I'm, well, one of the youngest people who made 16 million in crypto." Silence spread through the courtroom like a drawn breath. Even the cameras re-angled toward him, lenses widening. Caprio blinked slowly, starting to read the parking citation. A routine infraction? Barely worth a raised voice. The boy cut him off. Actually cut him off. "Look, let's not drag this out," he said, waving his phone as though the judge were a cashier. "Just tell me the amount. I'll scan you like a merchant. Faster for everyone." He pulled up a glowing crypto wallet, its rotating QR code pulsing on the screen, ready to transfer. Judge Caprio lifted an eyebrow, and the room understood, without a word spoken, something enormous was about to unfold. Judge Caprio didn't raise his voice. He simply folded his hands and asked, in the calm tone that had steadied thousands before the bench, "Why? Did you think interrupting the court was acceptable?" The boy's smile twitched, just barely. A faint tremor ran through the fingers still gripping his phone. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A crack in the steel mask he'd brought with him. He tried to cover it with a shrug. "I operate in a world where efficiency matters," he said lightly, though the words landed with sharp edges. "I've built systems, presented to investors twice my age. When time becomes expensive, manners get streamlined." A few people in the pews shifted uncomfortably. It didn't feel like arrogance now, more like someone repeating rules drilled into him until he mistook them for truth. Caprio let the silence hang a moment before asking, "Do you live with your parents?" The boy looked up, startled by the question's simplicity. For the first time, he didn't have a ready-made answer. His gaze faltered. "My dad works 16-hour shifts," he muttered. "Different cities, different weeks. We don't really talk. Hasn't been time for that in years." He cleared his throat as if sealing away something too raw to reveal. "I manage on my own." The courtroom absorbed that quieter note. It softened the edges of his earlier bravado, turning it into something far more recognizable: loneliness wrapped in achievement. Before the moment could settle fully, the clerk approached Caprio with an additional sheet. The judge skimmed it, then looked back at the young man. "There are two more violations linked to a different driver," he said. "A Michael Jerson. Same address as yours." The name hit the boy like a sudden draft. His shoulders tightened, his jaw locked for a fraction of a second. Caprio noticed. "Who is he?" "A neighbor," the boy answered too quickly. "Older gentleman. Sometimes I help him out. It's nothing significant." But the tone betrayed him. Gentler, almost protective, completely unlike the aloof confidence he'd arrived with. Caprio leaned back. "You took responsibility for your own citation immediately. Why hide a connection to these others?" The boy pressed his palm flat on the podium as if grounding himself. "Because it's complicated," he said quietly, "and it doesn't belong here." His voice wasn't defensive anymore. It was careful, guarded. Before Caprio could respond, a voice emerged from behind the second row, polite but steady. A woman in modest work clothes lifted her hand. "Your Honor, I know him." She nodded toward the boy. "And he's withholding something important." The boy spun around, startled. Recognition flashed across his face, unwelcome, uneasy. The woman continued, speaking with the textured calm of someone used to volunteering rather than accusing. "I run shifts at the food bank in the West End. He shows up every week. Brings groceries to an older man, Michael Jerson, a veteran. Lived alone for years." The room shifted again, but this time in a direction no one expected. She hesitated, then added, "3 weeks ago, Michael stopped answering the door. And this young man? He was the last person who saw him." A low murmur drifted through the benches. The boy looked trapped between wanting to defend himself and wanting to disappear. Caprio narrowed his eyes, not with suspicion, but concern. "Is that accurate?" The boy swallowed hard. "Please," he whispered, the bravado gone. "I don't want to talk about this here." The judge's demeanor changed. The lightness that normally floated around his rulings slipped away. His voice dropped into something steady and grave. "Son," he said, "whatever this is, it's no longer just about a parking violation. Is Mr. Jerson alive?" The boy stared at the floor. When he finally spoke, the answer was barely audible. "I don't know." Caprio lifted a hand, signaling a pause. "We'll take a short recess," he instructed the clerk, "and run a welfare check through the system." For the first time that morning, the courtroom felt completely still. Every eye fixed on the teenager who arrived believing he could solve anything with a QR code, and now stood there, looking like someone who'd been carrying a secret far heavier than money ever could. When the recess ended, the courtroom settled into a quiet that felt different, more alert, less forgiving. Judge Caprio returned with the kind of measured focus that signaled a shift in the room's gravity. He didn't resume with the usual warmth. Instead, he opened the folder on his desk and revisited the unresolved thread. "We were discussing the additional citations," he said, his gaze steady on the young man. "Why was Mr. Jerson's vehicle repeatedly parked in your space?" The boy's answer didn't come. He stared straight ahead, jaw tight, as if the question itself pressed against something he wasn't ready to release. Before Caprio could press further, movement in the second row caught his attention. The woman from the food bank, hands clasped gently in front of her, rose again. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's more you should know." The boy turned sharply. The expression he wore wasn't anger, more like a plea, as though he wanted to beg her to stay silent but didn't dare voice it. The woman took a cautious breath. "I've seen him visit Michael every week. He doesn't just bring groceries, he checks on him." makes sure the heat works, helps with medication reminders. He pretends it's no big deal, but he's been that man's only support for months. A ripple moved through the benches. The story was bending again, and no one could predict where it was heading. Judge Caprio's tone gentled a fraction. "Is this accurate?" he asked. The boy shifted his weight, a subtle restlessness, betraying the pressure building inside him. "I said I didn't want to talk about it here." The woman didn't back down. Her eyes weren't accusing. They were concerned. "The last time I saw Michael, he was unsteady on his feet. I asked if he wanted us to arrange a wellness check. He said no. But he looked frightened." She glanced at the boy. "And you were with him that day." The boy exhaled sharply, almost a flinch. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, fighting to keep his composure. "It's complicated," he said again, but now his voice carried strain instead of defiance. Caprio leaned forward. "Complicated how?" The boy hesitated, and the room held its breath. "Something happened," he said finally, "but I didn't hurt him. I'd never—" He caught himself, swallowing the rush of emotion. "I just can't explain it here." A hush swept the courtroom. The tension had shifted from irritation to genuine concern. The clerk approached the bench quietly and whispered into Caprio's ear. The judge nodded and folded his hands. "We're still waiting for a response from the police queries," he announced, "but I'll ask you directly once more. Is Mr. Gerson safe?" The boy's throat moved, but no sound came. He looked like someone standing on the edge of a confession that might change everything. "I don't know," he said at last, his voice cracking at the end. "I haven't been able to reach him." The words dropped into the room like weight. Caprio inhaled slowly, adjusting his glasses. "You understand how serious this is?" A nod, small, reluctant. The judge's expression remained grave. "Your behavior today, the interruptions, the bravado, that's one concern. But this is a different matter entirely. If there is a chance an elderly man is in danger, we cannot treat this casually." The boy pressed both hands against the podium now, as if steadying himself against a rising tide. Something in him had shifted, his earlier swagger replaced by something raw, unarmored. Caprio continued, "You arrived here trying to rush through a minor violation with a digital payment, yet everything we've heard points to a situation that goes far beyond parking." A few people leaned forward. Even the cameras seemed to pause, as though bracing for whatever would come next. The judge signaled to his clerk, "We'll extend the recess. Contact the police department again. I want an update on Mr. Gerson's status." Then he turned back to the boy. "When we reconvene, I expect the truth." The boy didn't argue, didn't gesture, didn't slip back into the persona he'd walked in with. He just nodded, quiet, defeated, and entirely different from the young millionaire who had tried to buy time with a QR code. The courtroom lights hummed softly as people whispered among themselves, sensing they were no longer observing a simple case, but the opening of a deeper story, one with stakes no fine could measure. And as the judge stepped away from the bench, the boy stood alone, a figure caught between fear of what had already happened and fear of admitting it. When the judge returned, the atmosphere carried the weight of a room waiting for news that might alter everything. Judge Caprio settled into his seat with a solemnness that silenced every whisper. "We have an update," he said. "Mr. Michael Gerson was transported to the hospital 2 days ago." The boy's shoulders dropped as if someone had clipped a string holding him upright. Not dramatic, just a quiet collapse of tension that had been coiled too tight. Caprio continued, his tone formal in a way rarely heard from him. "Neighbors told officers they saw you carrying him out of his home late at night. One of them called emergency services, concerned it might have been something else. The boy closed his eyes, gripping the edges of the podium. It wasn't a gesture of guilt, more like someone bracing for a truth he'd tried to lock away. Caprio's voice softened. "Tell me what happened." For the first time since entering the courtroom, the boy didn't hesitate out of arrogance. He hesitated because speaking seemed to tear something open. "He didn't have anyone," he said quietly. "I met him last year when his internet kept dropping. He couldn't figure out the router. I fixed it. After that, we just kept talking." The room leaned into his words as he continued. "He was a Korean War vet," the boy added. "His daughter moved to Texas. His wife passed 6 years ago. He didn't want people to see how much he struggled. So when his hands shook too much to cook, I'd bring food. When he couldn't reach the pharmacy, I'd go. It wasn't charity. He hated that word. We just kept each other company." This wasn't the voice of a millionaire prodigy. It was the voice of a 17-year-old who had finally lowered the armor he had spent years assembling. Caprio listened without interruption. "Those other parking tickets," the boy said, swallowing hard. "My car was in the shop. He lent me his old sedan. I didn't tell anyone because he thought accepting help made him a burden. He joked about dying before he'd admit he needed someone." A sad, tiny smile flashed and vanished. "But 3 weeks ago," the boy went on, "he was worse, weak, confused. I checked on him late one night. He had trouble standing. He wouldn't let me call anyone, kept saying he didn't want to be a case file." He tried to laugh it off, but he couldn't breathe right. The boy's voice thinned to a whisper. "I panicked." He swallowed, gathering himself. "I carried him to his car. Mine wasn't back yet. I put him in the passenger seat and drove as fast as I could. I didn't care about signs or zones. I only cared about getting him somewhere safe." Caprio's brows drew together, not in judgment, but in understanding. "That's why the car was in a restricted emergency area," the judge said. "That explains the last citation." The boy nodded, barely. "I didn't expect cameras. I didn't expect any of this. After they took him inside, I didn't know what to do. I kept checking the hospital site for updates, nothing. I convinced myself everything was fine." He paused. "And I convinced myself that if I just kept moving, kept earning, kept acting like I had everything under control, maybe I wouldn't have to feel how scared I was." Caprio leaned in, carefully. "And the way you tried to rush this hearing, the crypto transfer?" The boy exhaled a defeated breath. "Money fixes logistics. It makes things simple. I thought if I could pay my way out of this, I wouldn't have to face how badly I failed him. I thought speed would help me outrun the guilt." The courtroom didn't move. Not a single shifting foot or whisper. He added, voice cracking, "I wasn't trying to disrespect you. I just didn't know how to be the kid who messed up. I've only ever been good at pretending I don't." A wave of empathy passed through the room, quiet, human, unforced. Caprio nodded slowly. "Son, this isn't a story of failure. This is a story of someone who cared and didn't know where to put the weight of that caring." The boy's eyes glistened, though he blinked the emotion back before it could surface. What remained in the air wasn't guilt or fear. It was relief, fragile, but unmistakable, and a sense that one final truth still lingered unspoken, waiting for the right moment to surface. Judge Caprio let the boy's final words settle before he spoke. The courtroom had softened around them. No longer an arena of fines and citations, but a space where 2 generations confronted the weight of being human. He leaned forward, his voice quieter than before. "Son, you don't have to carry yourself like steel." The boy's head lowered, just slightly, as though the sentence struck a place he'd never allowed anyone to touch. Caprio continued, not as a judge reading from a script, but as a man who had lived long enough to recognize the hidden shapes of fear. Young people today are told they need to be invincible, that the world won't wait for them, that if they show hesitation, someone stronger will push past. He tapped the edge of his bench gently. But life isn't lived in constant acceleration. It's lived in the spaces where we slow down long enough to be honest. The boy swallowed, gripping the podium with both hands, not out of stubbornness this time, but because he needed something steady while listening. Money can do many things, Caprio went on. It can pay bills, repair cars, even open doors. But it can't tell you when you're overwhelmed. It can't guide you when you're scared. It can't teach you how to ask for help. Only people can do that. The boy's voice came out low, almost ashamed. I didn't want anyone to see how lost I was. I kept thinking if I hesitated, someone would call me a fraud. I didn't want to disappoint him, or anyone. Caprio's tone softened further. Son, strength doesn't come from pretending. It comes from telling the truth before it crushes you. The boy blinked hard. No tears escaped, but the struggle behind them was evident. I thought, if I just made enough, accomplished enough, nobody would notice that I'm still just a kid trying to figure things out. The judge nodded, recognizing the confession not as weakness, but as courage finally surfacing. There's no shame in being young, and there is no shame in making mistakes. What matters is what you learn from them. Then, shifting with gentle authority, Caprio addressed the consequence. As for your citations, I'll reduce the fines to the bare minimum. You acted in an emergency, and the law allows compassion where intent was honorable. A quiet sigh rustled across the benches. People weren't disappointed. They were relieved. But, the judge continued, there is another matter. Your attitude today, the interruptions, the attempt to rush justice with money, that needs correction. He paused, letting the moment land. So here is what I'm ordering. Community service. Not as punishment, but as perspective. The boy looked up, confused. Where? At the senior center on Elmhurst, Caprio said. They need young hands, and you, I believe, need the wisdom of people who have lived long lives. A hum of approval moved through the room. The boy nodded slowly, almost gratefully. He wasn't bargaining or bracing, just accepting. It was the expression of someone who had finally stopped running from himself. A few benches back, someone started clapping. Just once, a sharp, supportive sound. Others joined, cautious at first, then warmly. It wasn't applause for the judge, nor for the verdict. It was for the boy who'd walked in polished and impenetrable, and now stood unmasked but unbroken. When the noise faded, he spoke, steadying his voice with a breath. I guess I was never really wealthy. I just had access to money. He paused, the thought settling with new clarity. Real wealth is something else. And for the first time, his words didn't sound like a performance. They sounded like the beginning of wisdom. Judge Caprio rested his hands on the bench and let the room breathe for a moment. The tension that had filled the courtroom earlier had dissolved into something gentler, an atmosphere shaped not by rules and penalties, but by understanding. He gave a small nod toward the boy. This matter is concluded, he said, voice measured and warm. But before you go, I want you to hear one thing. He paused, the silence deliberate, the way older men pause, when they want their words to land exactly where they need to. Every one of us was young once, but not everyone gets the chance to recognize their missteps while they can still change course. You have that chance today. It wasn't a lecture. It wasn't admonishment. It sounded like a blessing. The boy didn't shift or glance away. He stood there taking in every syllable as though they carried a weight he'd never been offered before. Permission to be imperfect. Caprio closed the file gently and signaled that the hearing was officially over. People began gathering their coats, chairs scraped softly across the floor, and the quiet rustle of movement filled the air. But the boy didn't walk off, not immediately. At the door, he stopped. The subtle act turned more heads than any dramatic exit could have. He looked back toward the judge with a steadiness that hadn't been present when he first arrived. No bravado, no rehearsed confidence, just sincerity. "Your Honor," he said, voice low but clear, "I'm going to see Michael today, as soon as I leave here." He hesitated, then added, "If he's awake, I want to tell him I'm sorry for not handling things better, and, if you don't mind, I'll tell him you reminded me how to do things the right way." Caprio's expression softened into something almost paternal. He didn't offer a long reply. He simply dipped his head in acknowledgement, as if sealing an unspoken agreement between them. Two worlds, one built on decades of lived experience, the other on youthful urgency, finally aligned. There were no claps this time, no murmurs, just a shared respect hanging between them. As the boy turned to go, his phone buzzed in his hand, sharp and unexpected in the quiet corridor leading out of the courtroom. He checked the screen out of reflex. The moment he read the notification, he froze. One short message. "Patient Jerson is conscious, asking for updates about you." A breath escaped him. Half laugh, half relief, as though the air he'd been holding for days finally found release. His posture loosened, the stiffness melting away into something lighter, purer. He tucked the phone into his jacket, but the faint smile lingered, an unguarded expression that had no trace of the mask he once wore. He stepped into the hallway, the doors falling shut behind him with a gentle click. For a long moment, the courtroom remained still, absorbing what had unfolded. Not a scandal, not a spectacle, but a quiet lesson in responsibility and compassion. Somewhere in the back audience rows, a woman from the food bank wiped her eyes discreetly. A man in a work jacket murmured to his neighbor about kids doing the right thing. Even the clerk paused, glancing toward the exit as though witnessing the start of something rather than the end. Judge Caprio gathered his papers, slower than usual. Perhaps he, too, felt the weight of what had taken place. Not a legal victory, but a human one. As he rose to leave, he looked toward the empty aisle, where the boy had just walked, and allowed himself a faint, thoughtful smile. Outside, the winter sun filtered through the courthouse windows, brushing the floor with pale ribbons of light. The boy stepped into it without hesitation, heading toward the hospital and whatever conversations awaited him. No cameras followed, no audience applauded. It was simply a young man moving forward, finally unburdened. In the end, the story settled into a single truth, quiet, steady, undeniable. Sometimes the greatest investment isn't measured in dollars or gains, but in the time and care we offer another person when they need it most. And with that, the chapter closed, not with noise, but with the soft certainty of a life nudged gently onto a better path.